It's a real honor to be invited to give the Ralph L. Crosman lecture. I'm really grateful to Stuart, Nabil, and many others for the tremendous hospitality over the past few days extended to me and my wife Louise, and the very warm introduction from Chris just then. It really is a great pleasure to be here in Boulder. So just to recall the starting point, for a century or more in so-called developed democracies, it really hasn't been necessary to build a rationale for the public value of journalism. And by journalism I mean the institutionalized production of facts, information, and reference points of common interest for public circulation. Now, of course, there are always debates raging about whether particular things journalists do meet the moral standard that society would expect. Sometimes, clearly, they don't. And the recent UK phone hacking scandal is an egregious example of that. We have a lot to put right in journalism in Britain, quite clearly. And it's very common for these debates to rely on this notion of the free press, which mustn't be touched. But of course, they always assume that journalism is going to continue to exist. And so it really is a very different matter to build arguments as to why journalism now needs to exist. How, in order for it to exist, should it be funded? Or will it just survive anyway? So we shouldn't be worrying. And that warm glow that's cast by the principle of the free press, which seems to tell us everything we need to know, may be insufficient to ground an argument to recreate a free press in a digital world where an older model of the free press is under threat. Now, the late Ed Baker, the legal philosopher from the University of Pennsylvania, captured for me the sense of vertigo that I think is appropriate when discussing these sorts of questions in the following passage, which he published back in 1998. He wrote that democracy is impossible without a free press. At least courts and commentators tell us so. And this consensus, though, floats above crucial but more controversial matters. What type of free press does a democracy need? And why does democracy need it? And if governmental policy correctives are necessary, what interventions would promote a more democratic press? That is, a press that properly serves a society committed to democracy. Well, he wrote that then thinking maybe we didn't have to answer those questions. We could get away with it. But the digital world will almost certainly require us to address precisely these questions rather than floating above them. So I'm going to try and not float. I'm doing something which is setting something off, but I haven't yet worked out what it is.
Let's see if that does.
Okay. So I'm... No. Do you think I should take this mic off? Yeah. Let's take this off, because we don't want the sound distorted. Because I clearly don't need it. There's a wonderful ambience. Let's see if that's it, okay? So I'm not going to float above it. I'm going to come down to earth, hopefully with no further sound effects, and proceed. Okay, so the reasons why we really have got to address these issues are fairly well known. Digital media have generated two devastating and converging pressures for journalism, particularly newspaper journalism. The first is a loss of basic revenue because of an absolute fall in the economic demand for journalism caused by the unbundling of the larger media products in which journalism has historically been included, such as the newspaper. Second, more subtly, a shift in the provision of subsidy from advertisers. As Joseph Thoreau brings out in his wonderful book, The Daily You, the value of audiences to advertisers is now being fundamentally redefined. No longer the speculative value placed in an aggregate of viewers paying simultaneous attention to mass-targeted advertising content while really wanting to watch something else, the game. But instead, the precisely weighted value of the data that can be gleaned about an individual consumer by sending a particular, often customized ad to them at a particular moment when they're online doing anything whatever. Advertising value, less and less, depends on the cultural context of audiences' collective media consumption, and more on an instantaneous data point which lacks any context in the contents that media industries have historically produced. If so, the rationale for advertisers' historic cross-subsidy of large-scale media content is destined to evaporate like the Boulder snow, which I was able to observe on Monday afternoon, disappearing into the air. It doesn't happen in England. We just trudge through the mess. And if that happens, if that rationale for the subsidy, the cross-subsidy of journalism disappears, then journalism practices must become profitable in their own right, which aside from specialist outlets like the Financial Times, they often have not been in recent years, or they must benefit from new forms of subsidy from as yet undiscovered sources. Now, while the first force, the demand crisis, is most relevant to questions of the business model of journalism, and here there have been some new ideas for more successfully monetizing online attention or reducing the costs of journalism, proposed by the Harvard Business School, by the Tow Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. Those sort of issues concern me less as a non-specialist in journalism studies. By contrast, the subsidy crisis, the second force, interests me a lot because it requires us to rethink the meaning and purpose of journalism's rationale as it looks to external parties. So with some humility as a non-specialist in journalism, I want to explore with you tonight how, as citizens and not just journalists, we might begin to rebuild the rationale of journalism in ways that might convince a new range of external parties to provide subsidy. And my thoughts here, and I want to make this clear at the beginning, have gained a huge amount from discussions with Joe Turow himself, who's also at the University of Pennsylvania, and particularly from us co-writing an article on this topic to be published later this year in the International Journal of Communication. So where do we start? Well, one starting point, my starting point for getting interested in this debate, is the consequences longer term for democracy of the likely erosion, perhaps withdrawal, of advertisers' subsidy for media content. Democracy depends, surely, on some effective form of participation. And of course, media have played a major role for more than a century in sustaining that participation. In Robert Dahl's classic theory of polyarchy, which is basically a fancy word for the institutional frameworks that are preconditions for a working democracy, any regime is democratic only to the degree the political relations between state and citizens feature, as he puts it, broad, equal, protected, and mutually binding consultation. But obviously, such consultation is not even feasible without the common circulation of facts, themes, reference points as the background to that consultation. And such shared public reference points go, of course, beyond the news to include a wide range of materials, fictional stories, images, songs, a point often neglected in accounts of the public sphere. But my argument in what follows will focus, for reasons I'll explain, on rationalizing, justifying the subsidy given to journalism, especially news journalism. Now, of course, it's unhelpful to romanticize journalism's past. I don't want to do that. No one's pretending that the journalism of the mass media age was perfectly socially representative, or that it served democratic needs without any gaps or any negative side effects. The issue is much more serious. The issue is quite specific shifts in the operating conditions of today's journalism, specifically the risk of a progressive decline in journalism's role as a source for a common agenda of contention and mutual acknowledgement. An agenda through which we could recognize each other as, if you like, consulting members of a common social and political space. That's what we have to do. And as political philosopher Chantal Mouffe notes, democracy, if it's not just to be a form of disguised violence, requires that social and political adversaries recognize each other as legitimate adversaries. But that requires that they share some commitment to a system of reference, a way of living, or of assessing our lives. Now, how is such a shared commitment sustainable, long term, when advertisers and marketers are pursuing business goals that require, while professional content producers increasingly work by rules of thumb that permit, the optimal personalization of content around the features that mark off one consumer from another. That's the question. And these concerns go a long way beyond earlier concerns about the segmentation of the public audience that came with lots of TV channels or the early rise of the internet. Today we're seeing something much more worrying, which is, if you like, a sort of deep personalization of media content, content whose selection has already been decided for citizens based on criteria unknown to them, calibrated not to their actual selection decisions, but to big data generated assumptions about where those citizens will want to focus their attention, or maybe where the marketers ideally would need those citizens' attention to be focused. Now, specific concerns about this trend have already emerged in the political field regarding the segmentation of information in political campaigns, or in relation to information in the environmental sphere. Why is there a debate about global warming, given the state of the evidence? This is part of the root of the problem. But the concern we've got today is even wider than that. It is the adoption in all public communication of individualized information targeting as an overriding and not just an occasional principle. And the cause of this, of course, is not a conspiracy to remove people from collective experience or democratic participation. No one wants to do that. It's just an unintended side effect, or as economists put it, a negative externality. Sounds comforting, but it isn't. A negative externality of how advertising, big data, and content production have, it happens, come to coexist over the past decade and are likely to go on coexisting. And note its personalization at the level of news production, the inputs to news that I'm worried about. The personalization in the use or sharing of news may be absolutely fine. In fact, it may be very good. Underlying personalization of production of news is the issue of the increasing influence of revenue factors on news itself. And of course, this can operate on many levels. Most directly, the pre-adaptation of news stories to attract particular valuable readers, but also through the infiltration of revenue factors into the quality judgments that now guide broader news production. Let me just go over this ground a little bit more. The root problem here is expressed in a quotation from Joe Turo's wonderful book, The JLU. He's interviewing Rishad Tabakawala, a key strategic executive in the marketing industry, who said marketers haven't ever wanted to underwrite the content industry. They've been forced. Which implies that once advertisers are no longer forced, because they can reach audiences quite well another way, they will stop underwriting media content. Now, if this quote from a top marketing executive named recently by Time magazine as one of its 5 leading marketing innovators worldwide expresses the new direction of travel, the implementation is likely to take a number of forms, as Joe points out in our forthcoming article. The most obvious one is publishers working with advertisers to personalize the commercial messages that consumers receive around the editorial matter. We're sort of familiar with that. Increasingly obvious, noted by journalism commentators, is native advertising. That is, media content that supports the aims of an advertiser, is paid for by the advertiser, while it mimics the formatting and editorial style of the publisher that carries it. This is advertising then masquerading as something native to the journalistic domain. The New York Times new website design quarantines native ads within a boundary labeled paid post. But it's unclear how long this boundary will remain meaningful. Will we even notice? Will they just take away the thing and we won't even notice they've taken it down? It will all sort of be paid post, maybe. And then less common, but even more disturbing, is where publishers might change the agenda or content of material that they independently show visitors, their content, but based on what they believe they know about their visitors and what they think advertisers will want to know about their visitors. And there are signs this is underway, as Joe Turow points out in his 2011 book. As publishers become used to advertisers micro-targeting, and as native advertising becomes a part of the everyday landscape, it's easy to see, but we're projecting into the future a bit now, how publishers might move in this direction. Now, the danger, or the opportunity, depending on your viewpoint, is recognized by forces in the media industries, as captured by this quotation, which Joe included in our forthcoming piece. And it comes from the industry-oriented newsletter, Paid Content. He reads this stuff. I'm afraid I don't, but thank God he does. So this is from the Paid Content News of January 2013. Twitter's gotten even better and better at what's called entity extraction. Identifying a person, place, or thing, then associating behaviors and attributes around that thing. Real-time entity extraction, crossed with signals like those described above, is the Holy Grail. This is fundamentally the same goal that both Google and Facebook are focused on as well. How do you show users only things that are relevant to them and hide those that aren't in real time? Only relevant to them. That's the key point. So when over time, not in a year or two, but perhaps during the course of this decade, these three dynamics, targeted messaging, embedded ads, content producers' gradual personalization of content, increasingly work together, then we can expect marketers and their publisher partners to routinely show different constructions of reality to people that they categorize in different ways. People will not necessarily realize this is going on or understand exactly why and how, even if they do suspect it. Indeed, the logic expressed by that paid content writer of hiding in advance from individuals what is less relevant to them must automatically also hide the fact of its operation. What's present to us on the world stage will already, on this basis, have been adjusted by the operation of side doors that we knew nothing about. The mantra of increased relevance and more personalized service may, of course, disguise these tensions, enable us to live with them quite comfortably, and after a while, people may take such personalization for granted as the lens through which they must try to understand the world. But it's the long-term consequences of the shift that matter to the future of journalism. The direction of travel is now being recognized by a number of specialist journalism researchers, not just Joe Turow, but also American journalism researcher Matt Carlson. As he puts it, we may be witnessing a general shift, quotes, from journalists placing revenue concerns outside acceptable norms, the old church-state divide, to them including revenue as an acknowledged part of the news production process. Or, as British press researcher Francois Nell notes in a study of the UK local press, there is evidence that local press organisations in the UK are already removing the old boundaries between revenue and editorial and shifting towards a more market-oriented approach. Now, of course, there are counter-pressures to this. Large media will, for the foreseeable future, continue to make claims that they speak to the wider population. Indeed, governments rely on them to make such claims if there is going to be a space of appearances in which politics can get done. Mega events such as the Olympics generate their own centripetal advertising and marketing dynamics. And surely there's too much at stake from many institutional standpoints for media's claims to be central social institutions just to evaporate overnight. I've argued elsewhere that what I call the myth of the mediated centre will not simply or quickly disappear. But that myth will increasingly be at odds with other largely hidden pressures that disaggregate audiences into their individual components and then make value out of those components' particularity. Now, let's suppose this is the likely direction of travel for journalism's production and circulation, and we may debate later whether this is too pessimistic. If so, maybe we will have to get used to our democracies becoming spaces that lack any institution whose main purpose is to provide common information flows in the way that journalism classically sought to and claimed it did. We certainly can't assume that internal forces within existing journalism institutions will be strong enough to resist this shift over the longer term. Not even premium content sites are immune from these sorts of pressure. When The Atlantic was challenged about letting past its editorial team in 2012 a native ad for the Church of Scientology, its response was not to say this should never happen, but to apologize for how it was handled, while insisting that the direction of travel was inevitable. Meanwhile, the long-term economic consequences of declining readerships, changed production techniques in newspapers and to some degree TV news too, mean that there simply are fewer professionals around with the time, resource and standing to resist such challenges to basic journalistic values. And here I just want to stress that journalism institutions matter. Because as Columbia's Tow Center for Digital Journalism noted in its 2011 report on post-industrial journalism, institutions spread costs. They stabilize resources in ways that support individual journalists to write stories. Now, of course, some people, such as Jeff Jarvis, claim that the important thing is to free journalism entirely from the control of professional priesthoods, as he puts it. And no doubt some broadening of the range of contributors to news productions a really good thing. But it's very different from ditching institutions altogether. I think it's naive to try and solve the problem of institutional subsidy by celebrating the disappearance of journalism's institutions. Now, that's a rather fashionable argument, though. Now, if all this is right, and the basic dangers seem to be common ground amongst a number of commentators on journalism, from Joe Turow to Clay Shirky in New York, then even if we allow for variations between the media and advertising cultures in different countries, and things, by the way, look very different when I was in Portugal earlier in the month, if that's broadly true, then we can expect a drastic fall in many parts of the world in the subsidy that advertising gives to content production. And/or it's likely, I think, to be a combination, a shift in the rationale of whatever subsidy continues, so that that subsidy becomes increasingly conditional on news production's involvement in the determining aims of marketing organizations. And I want to suggest that that latter possibility, subsidy continuing but actually being a disguised form of subsidizing marketing content, is just as problematic as the loss of subsidy. When newspaper sales started plummeting, even before this shift in advertising dynamics, American writers such as Downey and Shudson, Nichols and McChesney started to debate the need for new forms of subsidy to journalism. But the problem we now face is even deeper. Because of advertising's drive to colonize aspects of news production, for example through native ads, we need to be equally clear on what types of subsidy cannot be accepted by journalists if they are to remain journalists. A broader question then emerges, not just what form subsidy should take, or how can the basic running costs of journalism be reduced in a world where we know the subsidy is going to fall overall, but we also, cross-cutting both those, have to ask ourselves, how can we rethink the relation between the desired goal, sustaining serious journalism in some form, and the incentives likely to motivate a range of subsidy partners that journalism in the future is going to need to attract. So we need to stay focused on the long-term task of reconstructing journalism's public rationale. But to repeat my opening question, where do we start? Well, I think the first step must be to go back to journalism's relationship to democracy. It doesn't matter what form of theory of democracy you espouse, journalism matters for democracy. Even elite democracy theory, that least democratic of democratic theories, depends on the assumption that knowledge is somehow diffused in a sufficiently effective way amongst the population, even if it relies more than other theories do on the role of expert elites. In other words, however dumb they are, the people are still going to know something if they're going to vote the right people in. Right? But on most theories of democracy, there's an even more role given to participation and journalism there. Now, the relationship between the press and popular sovereignty was seen fundamental to all defenders of democracy for 2 centuries. And forgive me for going through some very old and familiar reference points. As Alexis de Tocqueville put it in the 1830s, when the right of every citizen to cooperate in the government of society is acknowledged, every citizen must be presumed to possess the power of discriminating between the different opinions of his contemporaries and of appreciating the different facts from which inferences may be drawn. The sovereignty of the people and the liberty of the press may therefore be looked upon as correlative institutions. But what happens, I'm asking, when the common system for knowledge distribution, journalism, starts being organized on a different principle? The principle of circulating what merely passes for common knowledge amongst those who receive it in order to generate for advertisers better data on individual consumers. What if that trend is something that media companies, because they face harshly reduced returns on advertising, lack the power in all but the most exceptional cases to resist over the longer term? And let's bracket out here the differences in the development of public media in different countries, for example, between America and Britain. Because the question I want to focus on is how, in principle, would our argument for reconstructing journalism's rationale, how would it proceed in principle, regardless of the size of subsidy we've got to make up? It would obviously be even greater in the States than it would be in Britain. But the argument in principle is basically the same. That's what I want to explore. So we could appeal to democracy, and yet the appeal to consequences for democracy of these changes to journalism's form of subsidy is unlikely, I think, to be sufficient in itself. It's unlikely to be sufficient, at least, to influence the two parties to the current subsidy relation. The shift underway in advertising's relation to content producers, let's face it, is deeply embedded in the struggles of each of them for survival in drastically changed business environments. They will not be deterred from their survival strategies just because of the speculative side effects on something as abstract as democracy. The advertising subsidy was in any case never anything other than a fortunate accident. As that wise commentator Ed Baker noted, good journalism is a positive externality of commercial media operations. And positive externalities, a sort of loose social responsibility to make nice things happen somehow, has never made for a legally enforceable obligation. In fact, we wouldn't want states to force institutions to make those sort of nice things happen when they don't need to. We're even less likely, remember, to persuade advertisers and the growing data mining industry to promote positive externalities in a completely different sector from their own. A sector that they quite plausibly will say it was never part of their purpose to subsidize or promote. So it follows that a simple appeal to the values of democratic functioning is insufficient to justify, to call in subsidies for democracy, including for potential new subsidy sources such as NGOs. They too are unlikely to put their survival interests second to something as abstract as democracy. Now, one way to strengthen the appeal to democratic values would be to complicate the account of democracy with which we work. Let's try this for a moment. No single institution, surely, should be uniquely charged with implementing or underwriting democracy, neither journalism nor anything else. Put broadly, it may be that no institution will respond positively to Todd Gitlin's question from 2009, who is going to pay for serious reporting? Maybe we wouldn't want any single institution, whether the state or any other, to respond to that question with too much enthusiasm. But democracy, as the French political theorist Pierre-Antoine Vallon points out, democracy is a multidimensional, multi-institutional process. And if that's right, then the best accounts of media's contribution to democracy also have to be similarly complicated. Ed Baxter proposed himself a model of complex democracy which values on the one hand pluralism, the diverse expression of individual and group perspectives, and on the other hand the production of common ground. And that complex democracy in turn required, he argued, both segmented media that appealed to us in our particularities and general media, that is, media, as he puts it, that support a search for general societal agreement on common goods. Joseph Thoreau argues for something similar. So too is James Curran in Britain and Jürgen Habermas in Germany. And more radically, Clay Shirky argues that journalism from now on should be a series of open-ended experiments without any prejudgment about which model of journalism will work in future. Now, I agree with this pluralistic perspective. But within it, the problem is not that the shift in advertising subsidy encourages particularism and niche marketing, but the problem is that this particularism, this niche marketing, may be becoming journalism's only logic or dominant logic. And the problem is not that journalism no longer produces consensus, a society that's a coherent whole. It never did produce that, and that coherent whole never existed. The problem is that journalism risks becoming exclusively oriented to doing precisely the opposite of producing consensus, that is, producing difference. And here Razvan Fallon's detailed insights about democracy are quite useful. For him, and he doesn't care directly about our problem, but he's talking generally, for him the challenge for contemporary societies that aim to be democratic is to generate, as he puts it in rather elaborate language, an ensemble of actions and discourses for commonality that somehow make the system of social interactions more legible and more visible. Nothing less, he argues, is needed if contemporary societies are to recover what he argues we've lost over many decades, which is a practical experience of the general will. The general will that Rousseau saw as the basis of any possible democracy. Put in another way, a way of figuring out somehow together solutions to vexing problems of interdependence. He argues, well, we could argue that we will continue to need journalism to give us access to what he calls, in his general theory, a symbolic territory of shared trials, similar situations, and parallel histories. And the key word here, of course, is shared. If democracy is to remain a substantive, not just a fictional term, it must involve some sharing of experience, sharing of information, argumentation, empathy, celebration, across a range of social locations. Otherwise, members of a democracy will barely recognize each other as part of the same space. And yet the logic of deep personalization in advertising, which may be starting to colonize journalism too, is headed in another direction. And this surely must be troubling for someone, even if not necessary for those who in the past have subsidized journalism. So we seem to have got somewhere, but troubling is not enough to stop advertisers and data miners doing what they're otherwise supposed to do. Ed Baker already sensed a worrying tendency in his last book, Media Concentration and Democracy. He died back in 2009. He noted that the consumer shift to internet access to news could reduce the financial resources available to support serious commercial journalism. Worse, he said, the internet may be, he was putting it cautiously, but he was being prophetic here, the internet may be drawing down the relatively fixed pot of advertising revenue, potentially dramatically reducing advertisers' support of traditional media. So he already feared 5 years ago a shift from advertising money supporting journalists to it now supporting, as he puts it, the distributors of online content, the distribution system, if you like, such as search engines. In any case, as Baker also noted, if the costs of producing serious journalism remain constant, while the costs of other types of content production fall, as they have done, then there's already an economic disincentive against the production of serious journalism, which is why its subsidy must need a new rationale. And if that's right, then there's a problem with the whole environment of journalism and advertising today. It's not a matter of convincing particular institutions to think differently about the need for journalism. Rather, media industry's whole system of incentives and rewards is becoming skewed away from the funding of serious journalism, creating, if you like, a built-in democratic deficit, environmental in its scope and scale. Maybe we can try and capture this first through a metaphor. Let me have a try. I think we risk creating a landscape that has been cleared of one basic ingredient of democratic life: the reliable and regular exchange of common ideas, reference points, and facts about matters of common concern. We may come to inhabit an information landscape of constant updates on the issues that are closest to us, or assumed to be, interrupted from time to time by grand new spectacle and diverting curiosities. I take the metaphor of clearance from the transformation of the economy of the 18th century Scottish Highlands. Sorry for the image, but I'm biased in their favour. When a whole way of agricultural life and the people who sustained it were cleared from the land to make way for sheep. Only sheep were sufficiently profitable for the distant landlords, long sick of the low and fluctuating rents from tenant farmers and with their very large property bills in Edinburgh to pay. Visit the Scottish Highlands now, and it's empty, although beautiful in its vastness. It takes a considerable amount of archaeological inquiry to reimagine the dense living networks that once filled those empty valleys. Just as then, epochal change can today be driven by motives very distant from the practices of those most affected. Could today's flawed but still crowded landscape of news production be cleared over the next decade or two to suit the goal of rationalizing the advertising industry's delivery, leaving only traces for news antiquarians to marvel at? Well, by using an environmental metaphor, what I'm doing, of course, is trying to shift the debate into the realm of the social imaginary, to use philosopher Charles Taylor's term. Can we imagine being happy, living in a democracy with those features? Can we fail, whoever we are, to recognize the dangers to us all from such a transformation? The metaphor of an environment, of course, tries to imply a common need for action, such as emerged in the 1960s to 80s around the threats to our physical and biological environment. Just as our ethical understanding of the relationship between man, nature, and technology was transformed in the 1960s when we started realizing that our uses of technology might, through their side effects, damage nature, and so our relations with nature and therefore in turn change us. So today, the relationship to democracy of journalism through technology, journalism as an institution for the production of facts in common, so intrinsic a relationship that for 2 centuries we've hardly needed to defend it, that relationship perhaps is now being damaged by accident, with the risk that we too in the end will be changed. Now, of course, I'm not the first to introduce environmental metaphors here. Talk of the news ecology or the news environment has become quite common. But I do so to emphasize not just that news is an environment, of course it is, but to emphasize that news contributes to a wider public environment for democratic living. But even this doesn't perhaps get us far enough. Many may now be worried by these sort of risks, but why should advertisers in particular stop doing what they're doing when the problem surely is an accidental byproduct affecting all of us of what for them is just legitimate self-interest? Nor does the environment metaphor by itself really help us identify the precise danger to which we must avert. We have to therefore become a bit clearer on the damage that's being done by those corporate powers, by these trends that no one intends, just as we've had to become clearer about the dangers caused by the polluters of our rivers. And this means in turn being more explicit about how exactly we understand the practice of journalism today and why it is a practice vulnerable in particular ways, just the ways that are of intrinsic importance to other ways, wider ways of life, democratic or otherwise. And here we get to what I think is the heart of the matter. At this third stage of the argument, we have to explain more directly why something like a native ad undermines the basic purpose of journalism, why perhaps it pollutes it as an environment. And this takes us back to questions of journalism as a common social project. Early discussions about a free press, of course, emerged historically out of something broader than the press itself. They emerged out of the defense of the freedom of individual speech, from John Milton onwards. Milton himself used a pollution metaphor, drawing on a passage in the Psalms to talk of the streaming fountain of truth, which would be, quotes, turned to a muddy pool of conformity and tradition if freedom of speech and thought were constrained. By the time of Thomas Paine, a century later, modern understanding of society's complexity had come on a long way, and it had generated a knowledge problem that representative democracy was in part now designed, he thought, to address. The point for Paine in the late 18th century of the representative system and of the free press that might serve it was, to, quote, to diffuse such a body of knowledge throughout a nation on the subject of government as to explode ignorance and preclude imposition. So for Paine, rule, government in large societies require what he calls an assemblage of factual knowledge that no individual can ever possess. And that, by the way, ruled out for him on cognitive grounds monarchy and aristocracy. They just didn't have the brain power to run a society. Half a century later, for Tocqueville, as we saw, this equation, a working democracy with a working free press, had become almost automatic, but on cognitive grounds that were quite consistent with Paine's broader argument. That is that the press, remember, enables citizens to appreciate the different facts from which they can infer their opinions and make their judgments, and so participate in the workings of popular sovereignty. And then, as we saw, if we turn to late 20th century democratic theory, the even distribution of knowledge and the resources for interpreting it are proposed by Robert Dahl, the great political theorist, as one of democracy's key preconditions. Now, of course, the distribution of common factual information and reference points isn't the only thing media do and should do. I've already noted this plurality of media purpose is really important. It would be too much if we only had to read the Financial Times or the New York Times. We need some light relief. But we can perhaps distinguish quite easily four basic functions of media institutions that serve democracy. Some of them are more obviously cognitive than others. You may invent more. So one will be speaking up to power in a coordinated way, witnessing for individuals and groups, operating as vehicles for civil society organisation, providing a specialist information resource, at the least for the elites, maybe if you have a broader democratic theory, for all of us too. However, all of them depend, as their background, on the existence somewhere in the media sector of those who perform the more basic knowledge diffusion role. Otherwise, why bother to witness the lives of others? No one will know what you're talking about anyway. Or why bother to speak up for organizations or interests? Why, how and on what basis could journalism ever aim to speak up for power if there wasn't some basic circulation of information? But then again, I'm afraid there's another problem, which is that the relationship between media industries and democratic culture that I've been pretending is so simple has in fact never been straightforward or direct. Barbie Zelitzer, one of the previous speakers in this series of lectures, goes further. And she argues that in her article which came out last year, she argues that the term democracy should be dropped from debates about journalism and its rationale. Now, if we look closely at Zelitzer's argument, I don't think she even appears to deny that journalism is in fact necessary for democracy. She only shows that democracy is not sufficient for democracy. Of course it isn't. And she shows that democracy isn't necessary for journalism. It's not my argument to say it is. In fact, if democracy was necessary for journalism, then journalism could never have played the role it did along the road to democracy. In his iconoclastic way, Clay Shirky, I think, gets the main point better when he says in a blog from 2009 that society doesn't need newspapers. What we need is journalism. He means what society needs is journalism. So the point here is that journalism's rationale depends not necessarily on the contested term democracy, And maybe the strength of Zelitz's argument is to try and decouple the two. But instead, journalism's rationale, journalism in its cognitive aspects, can be related to a broader set of outcomes under which we've misleadingly subsumed democracy. And that broader aim would be the goal of human development. Some notion of social order in an era of complex interdependency. And I want to argue towards the end of this talk that whether or not we're explicitly building a democracy, effective government and an adequate ordering of social life now depend on the reliable exchange of information, accurate information, not promotional puff, throughout the social terrain. Journalism on this reading becomes a means of filtering basic knowledge for general social awareness. I say general social awareness. I don't just mean for governments to know things. Governments, of course, can't survive without our cooperation, but they may be quite happy to ensure our cooperation by feeding us a diet of illusion. So it's social awareness that we're concerned about. And without these basic information filtering and disseminating functions, there really is a risk of society lapsing back, for reasons of sheer complexity, not just the drive towards brutish violence that Thomas Hobbes emphasized, lapsing back into what Hobbes called the confusion of a disunited multitude. A confusion which will surely undermine business as much as democracy, social life as much as profit. And here I think, and this is the risk I'm taking at the end of this lecture, here I think we can move to a more fundamental reference point for our rationale of journalism, the theory of human development. This is philosopher Amartya Sen's double argument for both democracy and political voice. As, first of all, things that are intrinsically good, as enactments of political freedom, which itself is a dimension of general human freedom. But even if that argument doesn't work, as necessities, assuming we care about human development, that is. We're not just happy staying exactly as we are. People must, he argues, be able to formulate what their development needs are and if they're going to be aiming at them. And that in turn requires the flow of common information about actualities and possibilities, which then in turn argues requires free media. Not just any media, but quite clearly media with a built-in component of journalism. And Sen's detailed discussion implies the basic roles of journalism that I mentioned earlier. And that's interesting because he wasn't thinking about the threats to journalism except from political force in his book, written in 1999. The things he thinks are basic to human development in countries such as India, China, wherever we look, are, for example, speaking up to power, witnessing suffering, for example, witnessing a government's failure to deal with famine in its own territory, making demands on behalf of social groups who are starving, and the provision of information necessary to fuel what he calls the evaluative need for public discussion. Now, in this fundamental sense, according to Sen, but by the way, this is completely against the realpolitik of market fundamentalists. According to Sen, broader economic or development needs always add to, rather than subtract from, political needs. In other words, we don't have to resign ourselves to a zero-sum game between economic growth on the one hand and human development on the other, as some commentators on the crisis of journalism like to imply. Sen emboldens us to ask, what would economic growth really be if its side effect was always to undermine key means of supporting political freedom, and so undermining human development? Sen's answer is that it would not be genuinely economic progress at all. And you'll notice that I've not relied at any point in my argument on Jürgen Habermas's public sphere theory. So if there are any devout followers of Jürgen Habermas tonight, I apologize and we will speak afterwards. But there's a reason for this, which is that much as I respect his work, I'm deeply skeptical about any argument based, as Habermas's arguments always are, on the supposed norms of rationality itself. If there are such norms. But even if there are, these arguments are very unhelpful when we're dealing with a situation caused by competing rationalities. Corporate or economic rationalities on the one hand versus democratic or social rationalities on the other. They're all legitimate. No one knows how to trump one against the other unless we get out of the space of thinking only in terms of rationalities. Our best chance of getting onto solid ground, I think, following Sen, is when we articulate, if you like, an overarching, an inherently pluralistic goal such as human development, which gives us a vantage point both on economic freedoms and on political freedoms and on the practical relationships between them. Human development itself, on any coherent account, according to Sen, requires some institutions free to carry out the fundamental information sharing role of journalism from which I began. And therefore it requires processes likely to generate and sustain such institutions. Now you might, however, object, I've just got round the problem with a few fancy quotes. I've just got round the problem, the real world problem of rationalizing the subsidy of journalism by placing it in some cloudy, vast academic context. But it's this expansion of focus that is precisely the point. Sen's argument shows us that the defense of democratic practice and therefore free journalism is part of the wider aim of human development, which also encompasses, in some sense, economic growth, the development of our means of living well. As Sen has done ever since his 1987 book on ethics and economics, a book I think we need to go back to more and more, we can and we must always relate economic goals to wider ethical aims. That is the achieving of a good life in common. And if you object that the practical pairing of journalism and a good life in common isn't a given, of course I agree, but that's just a measure of the complexity of the social, economic and political processes to which journalism rightly contributes. So, to sum up, my argument has been of a general normative nature. Maybe I've hovered too much about the facts, but as I said, I'm not an expert in journalism. I'm responding as a citizen. That's what I'm trying to do tonight. So let me close with 4 points that attach my argument more directly to a practical context. I'll be much blunter here. First, since the size of the likely subsidy loss to journalism, both in Britain and the US, is potentially very large, larger, as Emily Bell notes, probably than the size of the subsidy that's available today. There's going to be a net deficit, in other words. If so, then it makes no sense to undermine existing structures of journalism support, such as the BBC, including its World Service, which has its haters and attackers in Britain. It makes no sense to undermine them when they clearly work. We have to avoid arguments of the form, everything is changing, so let creative destruction have its way. Although I note nervously that Harvard Business School's leading expert on creative destruction, according to his website, Clay Christensen, has recently turned his attention to newspapers and journalism in a report last year. I'll come back to him. Second, again, given the size of the problem, journalism clearly will need subsidy from a widening range of institutions. And I don't have the answers to who those institutions are any other than you, but we could discuss this. So governments, at least indirectly, in some form, universities perhaps, philanthropists, civil society organizations of all sorts of sizes. Subsidy should be welcomed in many forms and from many sources, wherever it's oriented, at least in part, to supporting a common information infrastructure, not just particular sectional ends. Hence the need for a rationale for journalism broad enough to bring together a very wide range of parties, which is the sort of argument I've been attempting tonight. But third, we have to be clear about what types of subsidy will not support the deep project of journalism that we want supported, even while appearing to support institutions and journalists who still claim to be doing journalism. I've referred to the pressures of deep personalization that come from the desires of advertisers to create new platforms for the mutual benefit of advertisers and content producers. Bid2Let recently announced a sort of platform for native ads that make them more functional, whizzier, and so on. There are plenty of other sources of subsidy as well outside the advertising industry who are also quite capable of exacting an unacceptable price for their subsidy in terms of tying information outputs more closely with their aims rather than with the production of facts that matter to us in common. Fourth and finally, sociologists of media like myself cannot be satisfied with refining normative arguments in support of journalism. We don't need to. You understand these arguments. I'm just trying to re-articulate them in a form that we can go out and use. So we also need, as sociologists, empirically, to consider the wider ways of life within which this struggle for the future of journalism is now being fought out. When he was considering the growth of the modern newspaper almost a century ago, the sociologist Robert Park wrote that reading, which was a luxury in the country, had become a necessity in the city. And now, as new forms of subsidized news production may emerge, we need to study the new social contexts in which they are perhaps coming to fit, maybe coming even to seem necessary and right. But we also need, in reverse, to consider what happens to people's ways of life in urban and other spaces when older forms of news, for example, the local press, so severely threatened in America and in the UK, are literally falling apart. For in those contrasting contexts, some where an older journalism is disappearing, others hopefully which show signs of new journalistic forms, it's here, I think, that we will find the clues to possible new sources of subsidy and new rationales for how funding journalism can make practical sense to particular social actors. Paradoxically, Harvard Business School's Clay Christensen, in his paper last year on radical change in the journalism industry, also argues that new models of journalism should start not from abstract business considerations, but from, as he puts it, the human tasks that journalism helps us get done in daily life. And in a sense, I think he's right. But as yet, we're only at the start of this new subject, where our needs as social and civic beings and our curiosity as sociologists come together, a long shared project for reconstructing the rationale for journalism from which we cannot afford to hold back. Thanks for listening.